Our main story tonight concerns something Americans simply can't get enough of: prison. We love to be entertained by it, from Orange is the New Black to seemingly MSNBC's entire weekend programming to the TNT classic Tim Robbins Stands Shirtless in the Rain, the movie. We love prison so much, a shocking number of Americans are currently inside one, as we learned last week during a House Judiciary Committee hearing.
Our nation now has the greatest number of prisoners of any country in the world. Nearly 1 in every 100 adults in America is in prison or jail.
That's true. We have over 2 million people behind bars right now. We have more prisoners at the moment than China. We don't have more of anything than China, other than, of course, debt to China. And it didn't always used to be this way. Our prison population has expanded 8-fold since 1970. The only other thing that's grown at that rate since the 70s is varieties of Cheerios. F*** you, Fruity Cheerios! You trumped up Fruit Loops and you know it! And look, our prison population has exploded for a number of reasons, from the dismantling of our mental health system to mandatory minimum sentence laws, which help explain why 97% of people plead guilty to federal crimes rather than risk going to trial, to, of course, drugs. Because half the people in federal prison are there on drug charges, and it accounts for 1/4 of admissions to state prisons. And, of course, it's tricky to know how to feel about all this, because, on the one hand, the war on drugs has completely solved our nation's drug problem, so that's good. But, on the other hand, our drug laws do seem to be a little draconian and a lot racist. Because while white people and African Americans use drugs about the same amount, a study has found that African Americans have been sent to prison for drug offences at up to 10 times the rate, for some utterly known reason. It reminds me of a joke. You know, black people who commit drug offences, they go to jail like this, whereas white people don't go to jail at all. In fact,
I'm Megan Murphy for the Huffington Post. More black men are in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. That's the word from Ohio State law professor Michelle Alexander, who's promoting her book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. News One reports, according to U.S. Bureau of Justice estimates, as of 2008, more than 846,000 black men were in U.S. prisons, constituting 40.2% of all inmates in the system. In an interview with the Washington Journal, Alexander argues the incarceration rate for black men is just a new way to discriminate.
It's no longer appropriate or acceptable to use race as explicitly as a justification for discrimination. Instead, today we label people of color criminals primarily through the war on drugs. We label them felons and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind.
LA Progressive reports the numbers back up Alexander's theory. Even though studies have shown that whites use and sell illegal drugs at rates equal to or above blacks, in some black inner-city communities, 4 of 5 black youth can expect to be caught up in the criminal justice system during their lifetimes. And a Color Lines blogger adds that cycle affects more than just urban black communities. As we saw during last fall's elections, millions of America's black voters have been disenfranchised. An estimated 5.3 million Americans have currently or permanently lost their right to vote because of felony convictions. But for black men, the rate is 7 times the national average. These numbers are sure to take on even more significance as the 2012 campaign season kicks into high gear. For the Huffington Post, I'm Megan Murphy.
If you don't know a prisoner, though, or think that you're ever likely to become one, then their safety and health is not going to be high on your list of priorities. You don't need to know anything about the conditions that they live in. But you know who should know? Well, maybe the director of federal prisons. And yet, watch him almost comically struggle to recall a basic detail about one of the most mentally excruciating things prisoners can be subjected to: solitary confinement.
How big is a cell? How big is the average cell in solitary?
Say the average size?
Cell, yeah, the size of the cell. How big is it? What is, I'm trying to get this is the human thing we're talking about. We've got a lot of statistics. How big is the cell?
The average size of a cell is I guess I'm trying to find, you're looking for the space of what the...
Yes. The dimensions in feet and inches. The size of the cell that a person is kept in. I want to get some idea of, I don't know, am I asking this wrong?
No, you're not. You are not asking it wrong. As far as I can remember, you're just asking him what the size of the f***ing cell is. But it was a long time ago. And to be fair, he did eventually get an answer.
The average size should be equivalent to 6 by 4.
What, 6 by 4? A couple of things there. One, that was clearly a guess. And two, 6 by 4 is barely an elevator. That is the length of a 6-foot party sub by the length of the amount of that party sub that's left over the following day, because nobody wants party subs. No, people put their hands all over them, they're disgusted. No one, that's not the point. That's not the point. But thankfully, a few minutes later, the record was corrected.
For the actual is 10 by 7 for the cell size.
Ooh, 10 by 7. Step this way, Your Highness. Plenty of room for a ping-pong table and an imaginary opponent as your mind slowly becomes untethered. What is clear...
Texas Governor Rick Perry says the state will not comply with new measures to help reduce rape in prisons. The Justice Department laid out rules to prevent these rapes, such as separating teens from adults and eliminating cross-gender pat-downs. But Governor Perry says it's nearly impossible for Texas to comply with the measures. For example, Perry says Texas considers 17-year-olds to be adults, so it would be too costly to separate teens from adults. He also claimed that if female correctional officers cannot pat down male inmates, then they would be denied job assignments and promotions, which Perry noted is a violation of anti-discrimination laws. So in a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder, Perry said this: Washington has taken an opportunity to help address a problem in our prisons and jails, but instead created a counterproductive and unnecessarily cumbersome and costly regulatory mess for the states. I encourage the administration to change these standards and do so soon. Absent standards that acknowledge the operational realities in our prisons and jails, I will not sign your form, and I will encourage my fellow governors to follow suit. So, Jason, what do you think? I mean, does Perry have a legitimate point here?
Well, there's two things that Perry said with regards to this law. He said the law would be too cumbersome in Texas and too counterproductive. He's on safer ground with the cumbersome part.
Prison employees in Jackson have been caught drunk on the job and smuggling in marijuana. Now around 30 inmates are sick after workers found maggots inches from meal trays. It is the latest bad headline for Aramark, the private company hired to handle prison food services in Michigan. News 10's Lauren Fultonberg asked the Department of Corrections if it's having second thoughts.
Things didn't need to be razor sharp when new management took over a Jackson prison. But half a year later, the Department of Corrections may be slamming the door for some leniency.
They're now into their 7th month of this contract. We're kind of through the transitionary period right now, and we're going to aggressively monitor all elements of the contract.
This time it's fly larvae and maggots inches from trays in the cafeteria.
They broke down that piece of equipment, thoroughly cleaned it, and are making necessary repairs right now.
But now roughly 30 inmates are sick.
Vomiting, upset stomach, diarrhea, headaches.
And the DOC is placing the blame squarely on Aramark.
The sanitary conditions are their responsibility. It's their obligation under the contract to have clean and sanitary kitchen environment.
But a spokeswoman for Aramark said in a statement that there's no evidence the maggots and the illness are related and that repairs are being made right away. She says Aramark is still the right company for the job.
I ask you.
But the unions that lost out on the contracts disagree, calling Aramark's services insufficient and inferior, and telling us in May they had concerns.
When you have problems with food, when you have problems with contraband, when you have problems with employees that are overfamiliar with prisoners, that's bad in an institution. So we're worried.
The DOC says it's time to put those concerns to bed.
I think they're to the point now in their contract where we expect, I think the citizens of Michigan expect them to follow the elements of their contract.
The DOC doesn't know if any maggots actually got in the food, so it's impossible to say if the larva and the illness go together. But the prison health teams say these kinds of illnesses are typically the result of something you eat.
So, Lauren, how will the DOC deal with this? Can we expect any discipline here?
Well, the DOC doesn't expect any repercussions, at least immediately. The prison told Aramark about the situation over the weekend, and Aramark says it will fix the situation. DOC spokesman Russ Marlin won't say that Aramark is on the hot seat, but last week the department threatened to cancel its contract if something isn't done about food shortages and menu substitutions.
But Marlin isn't ready to send Aramark packing yet.
No, he's still behind them on this one. He's still behind them on this one, and he thinks this $145 million contract will still save taxpayer dollars.
All right, Lauren, thanks.
Joseph Wood was convicted of shooting and killing his girlfriend and her father 25 years ago. He was sentenced to die for the crimes, but Wood's execution by lethal injection didn't go as planned.
It was very disturbing to watch. Joe Wood is dead, but it took him 2 hours to die. I can liken it to if you catch a fish and throw it on the shore, the way the fish opens and closes its mouth.
Critics say that makes 3 bungled executions in the U.S. since January. All were by lethal injection. It took 26 minutes for convicted murderer and rapist Dennis McGuire to die in Ohio. Witnesses say he gasped and sputtered on the table. Oklahoma's Clayton Lockett, who shot and killed a pregnant woman, died of a massive heart attack after 43 minutes. The problem is, states can't buy the same drugs they used to for executions. Companies either aren't making them or don't want their products to be used to kill people. So prisons are essentially experimenting with different compounds. The whole system of killing criminals costs the U.S. billions a year. And this opponent of capital punishment says Americans are getting fed up.
The sense of incompetence in government action, I think, is what's burdening the death penalty and shifting public opinion.
But the family of Joseph Wood's victims says the debate doesn't make sense.
This man, conducted a horrifying murder. And you guys are going, oh, let's worry about the drug and how he affected. Well, why didn't we give him a bullet? Why didn't we give him some Drano?
Arizona's governor put out a statement saying Wood didn't suffer and justice was done. In contrast, she said, to his victims and their families. She did order a full investigation into why the execution took so long. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Washington.